Hello? Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. I'm Becky. I was married to Gary. I know that was kind of an anomaly to consider in Swenson's life, but it did actually happen. It's quite odd to be in Seattle without Gary. Flying in the other day was kind of emotional, but anyway, this is a party, and Gary loved parties, and he was known to give a few really spectacular ones himself, and it didn't really need to be a special occasion. It could be Monday night, it could be Wednesday night, it could be Sunday morning, and he was up for a party. Why don't I have our relatives, we have children over here. Could you raise your hands, girls and boys? We have my daughter Harlow, or my granddaughter Harlow, and Veda, our granddaughters. Ethan is my nephew, and Emily is my niece from Southern Washington. And we have, my daughter, Laura, and her wife, Shannon. And we have Karen Kerbacher, Gary's niece, and her daughter, Jillian. And next to them, we have Mike Utt, Gary's cousin, and his partner, Ann. And who do we have back there? Boy, can't see. Swensons. Lisa Swenson, Isabel Swenson, Greg Swenson, Clark Swenson, and who am I missing? Nobody. Okay, and my stepmother, Janet. Sorry? Corringtons. Where are my Corringtons? Cousins and Ron and Jill Anway, cousins. So now do we have everybody? Thank you. I apologize. First of all, I'd certainly like to say a hats off to Swenson Say Fagét, or SSS as they are known now, for making the video stream possible. And what you need to know about that is if you are just dying to go back and revisit this afternoon, you can go to YouTube and see it again. People often ask me, they're very interested to know how Gary and I met. And there's the long version and there's the short version. I'm going to give you the short version. I had a job in the summer of 71, I believe, at the University of Washington Hospital Division of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation. And there I met a young woman by the name of Elizabeth Rogers, who was a social worker. And as often happens in office settings, office chit-chat, I heard that Elizabeth lived with this guy named Gary Swenson. Okay, fine. Life went on, and I went off and married my husband, Laura's father, and I'll be doggone, Elizabeth and Gary came to the wedding. So in my wedding guest book is Gary's name. Yeah. So I went off and did my Army wife thing and had a baby Laura, and about 4 years later, decided this was going to change, so I came back to Seattle without my husband. And about that time, Janet, my stepmother, threw a birthday party for my father. How many of you remember Henry's Off Broadway? Only us ancient people remember that place now. But so Elizabeth and Gary were no longer living together by that time, but true to Gary's form, remained close friends with Elizabeth. So when Elizabeth was invited, she invited Gary. And Gary sat across the table from me at my father's birthday party, and that is how it all started. And that was in probably January of I can't remember if it was 1977 or 78, but that was the beginning. That was 40 some odd years ago. So that was kind of the beginning of how this all transpired. Laura and I were immediately welcomed into the Swenson clan, open arms, no questions asked. My father, on the other hand, was another story. And if any of you ever knew my father, you would know that he was not one to keep his opinions to himself. He made it very, very clear that he had no time or acceptance of the fact that Gary was going to live with me, or I was going to live with him, but he wasn't going to marry me. And I didn't really know at that point in time if, as a single mother with a 3-year-old, that I really should hitch my wagon to this bachelor. But I sort of intuitively looked around, and I looked at Gary's friends, and I looked at his family. I looked at how he treated Elizabeth, and I looked at how much fun, how interesting, and how kind he was. And he pretty much came to the determination that it was probably going to be okay. It was probably going to be okay because Gary was probably going to be there for us no matter what. And he was. So anyway, the long and the short of it is we lived together 18 years before we married. Excuse me. And true to Gary's form, he didn't verbalize and go on and on and on about whether or not this should happen. He just looked at me one night at the dinner table and he says, "I think we need to have a conversation." And I thought, oh shoot, we got to have a money talk again. And he says, "I think we should talk about whether or not we should get married." I nearly fell off my chair. I just really didn't think I would ever hear that coming from his mouth. So we immediately, of course, started planning a party. And so in September of 1996, Gary and I were married. He also, by the way, immediately became my dad's best buddy. Gary was an absolutely amazing man. I know of no one that lived a life with more vigor or interest or energy. He was interested in everything and everybody. He was accepting and forgiving. He was kind. He was generous. He was handsome. And he was more fun to be with than I can even tell you. He absolutely loved his work. My one regret in life is that I never found work that I just absolutely loved, because it was an unbelievable thing to see. And he, as people say, he was the first one in the office every single day and very often the last one to leave. But that was fine. And he'd leave the office and go play handball. He was a cyclist. He was a tennis player. He was a runner. He did marathons and triathlons. He was a hiker. He was a tennis player. He was a handball player, later a racquetball player, and an overall arch of all of this, of course, was the sailing and the sailboat, which was pretty much a constant in our life until not very long before we left for San Diego. In fact, he was so interested in, he never worried about things. he was so optimistic that he knew things were going to resolve somehow. Somehow they would resolve. So why worry about it? And to wit, he was absolutely certain that Laura and I had to be able to handle the boat. So, of course, Gary had to get back to Seattle to work, and he left Laura and I in the San Juans on the sailboat. And he flew off in a floatplane. And we had our problems. We had a problem or two. But I had a problem with I don't know what it's called, the kill switch on a diesel engine. Wouldn't kill. And I didn't know what to do about it, so I got in a dinghy and rowed over to another boat, and the guy came and showed me how to flip the little lever and kill the engine. We anchored in Friday Harbor where we were going to pick Gary up, and I don't know if Friday Harbor is pretty deep, and so that meant I put a lot of anchor down, a lot of rowed out, and back down and set the anchor, but it meant I had a whole bunch of swing. This guy in a smaller boat comes up, turns off the engine, takes his anchor and goes plop, gets in his rowboat and goes to town. And sure enough, his boat just backed right down, bam, right into the bow of our boat. Anyway, we survived that too. And so did the boat. In about 2016, Laura kind of started lobbying for us to come to San Diego. And we now had 2 granddaughters. And Gary had kind of started to have a little bit of physical trouble. And we lived in a 4-story house in West Seattle. So, in typical Swenson fashion, one night we were sitting at dinner and he said, "So, are we moving to San Diego?" I think that was probably in the fall. By April of the following year, we had sold everything in Seattle and moved lock, stock, and barrel to San Diego. He began to have some fairly significant physical problems, mostly vascular disease. Congestive heart failure, some lung issues, so that he had to be on oxygen 24/7. So he was tethered to a machine all the time. He, this last year, had developed serious blood clots in his lower leg. And he had previously had those successfully removed. And so we kind of expected that it was going to be business as usual. Well, it was not, and the first attempt was not successful, so they took him back to surgery a second time, and in the process of doing this, they basically the surgeon described it as a soaker hose, like you're in your garden with holes where the water comes out. But basically, they thread it down your artery in your leg, and so then they can deliver directly to the artery anticoagulants. And that meant he had to be in ICU and he couldn't turn. So the nurse would come in and turn him every couple hours, and pillows and this and that and the other thing. And the last day, this nurse came in and did that, and she said, "Now, is there anything else I can give you or get for you that will make things easier?" And I'll be doggone, he looked at her and he said, "A glass of Chardonnay would be really great." So, and that was the day he passed. And so there were these flashes of Gary that kind of came back. And we came to Reichel Smith's memorial in this room in September. And we were all kind of concerned that Gary wouldn't be able to speak. And he got up and spoke. He broke down and cried, and he pulled it together and went on. So we miss him. He's a presence that I hardly know what to do without, but he was a pretty good guy, and we had a pretty good life together. So anyway, I'm going to shut up. We have a few people that I've asked to speak, and when that's over, anybody that would like to say anything, I would really love it if you would come. and speak. So, Ron, please.
I'm a little tired, and I have to fly out tomorrow, so I asked her to put me on first. My name's Ron Hand. I met Gary and Becky in '92 when I began dating Jan Gleason. During numerous encounters, I couldn't help noticing that Gary was a snappy dresser, as opposed to some of us. I never saw the same outfit twice. And no doubt he owned this humongous wardrobe. Closet probably went 40 feet. And imagine my surprise when I learned he lived on a sailboat that was 40 feet. But that turned out pretty well because I was able to go on the boat many times. My first sail on Gaia was on Puget Sound. I remember sun, scrumptious hors d'oeuvres, fine wine, and Maria Callas belting arias across the waves. It was a great time. And that was merely the beginning of adventures with this trio. Gary was a take-charge guy, up for anything. Intensely focused, he loved to laugh, had a voice that carried. Jan once remarked that if you were joining Gary's party at a restaurant, you needn't check in with the staff. Just wait a few seconds. You'll hear him. The four of us frequently traveled together. We rented canal boats in both France and England. Gary, of course, was the captain. The three of us, his crew. And we passed through locks or tied up on a bank to explore local villages, sightseeing, replenishing our necessities like wine, cheese, and olives. Gary daily checked the engine's oil level, pored over the route map as he figured out how many locks we needed to pass through on any given day to timely return our boat on time. I forget how many locks we went through in a week, but we became experts. We also trekked in Nepal and vacationed in Turkey, where you know you're on foreign turf the very first morning when you're awakened at 5 a.m. by the first of 5 daily calls to prayer that blast over speakers around the city. Gary's focus also extended to exercise. He liked to do his best in everything. I had no problem biking with him or playing tennis. We were of equal skill. But when his usual racquetball partner was put out of commission after a surgery, I was asked to fill in. I had never played the sport, but Gary assured me I would do fine. Then he saw me in action. I was not asked back. Gary also loved to eat, sometimes intensely. One time in Barcelona, Becky, very pleased with her steak, offered Gary a bite. He not only took the offering, but he downed it so quickly it became lodged in his throat. He could still sip water and breathe, but he was in discomfort. Hoping that gravity would resolve the issue, he returned to the hotel and waited. But the chunk remained lodged. He could still sip and breathe, but he was in, whoops, I just read that. And nothing seemed to help him. I finally approached the hotel desk to see if they had a doctor on staff. They did not. But the manager had a ready suggestion. Apparently, Gary wasn't the first traveler who savored Spanish beef to the point of bolting it whole. Directing me to the nearest supermarket, he suggested I purchase Lowry's meat tenderizer. Well, there did seem to be a certain logic to the idea. Since Gary could still trickle water and breathe, time didn't seem to be of the essence. I made the purchase. Gary tried it. We waited. Gary suffered. We waited some more. None of us knew how long these amazing chemicals would take to break down steak, but we didn't have other ideas. Eventually, we gave up and hailed a taxi for the nearest hospital. We immediately got attention. Gary was examined by several people over the next few hours. X-rays, poking and prodding, and a barium swallow. Though since swallowing was the issue, I wasn't holding out much hope. He was there for so long that we, his support staff, went out for dinner. When we returned, the medical minds of Barcelona had reached a decision. They were going in. We waved goodbye. Gary was loaded onto a gurney and wheeled down the hallway. We waited half an hour for news. Finally, the patient returned, somewhat disheveled, but under his own power, and flashing that fabulous smile. He told us they took a camera with prongs, slid it down his throat, and grabbed the meat. Enough already. After handshakes all around with the doctor and his assistants, 2 armed guards immediately approached to escort us to the financial desk. We speculated that we could have done the extraction right off, and instead of what we thought was a prudent and cautionary approach, maybe they had merely been running up the bill. Would Gary and Becky have to take out a loan or refinance the property? The guard presented the paperwork to the accountant, who punched a bunch of keys, then a few more for good measure, and the total was passed across to us. We couldn't believe it. $30. God bless socialized medicine. What would have cost a foreign meat gobbler in the U.S. Sadly, Jan passed early in 2010. Gary and Becky were extremely helpful throughout that process and even emceed her memorial. I eventually moved to Costa Rica, where I met Lilia. Gary and Becky agreed to visit, and Lilia planned some outings. Since we lived a couple of hours away from the airport, I suggested they take small sightseeing trips in San Jose while we awaited delivery on a new vehicle. Though we were planning to visit the Oso Peninsula, a very primitive place, I didn't think we'd need the 4-wheel drive option, as we weren't planning any off-roading events. Drake Bay, the most populated destination on the peninsula, could be reached by boat or by car. Since the map indicated decent roads, we plowed on. Unfortunately, the roads, though decent, were all unpaved. After climbing numerous tire-spinning hills and fording 5 creeks, we arrived at our destination. Well, sort of. It was on the other side of a river. A local on the other side waved me across. He had just crossed it in his flatbed truck, after all. He had huge tires and no doubt sufficient gearing. As I pondered the decision, the sun was setting. Should I go for it or not? Suddenly, I recalled the movie It's a Mad, Mad, Mad World. And I recalled the scene where Phil Silvers floats helplessly downriver in his car after stupidly miscalculating the crossing of a river. I opted to turn around. Gary, of course, was disappointed. He had wanted to see everything. They did return 6 years later. By now, Gary was slowing down. It was noticeable when we drove to a volcano and Gary walked along a trail to the observation area, but the air was thin and he needed oxygen. But staying in the car was not an option. He moved more slowly, but he made it under his own power. Whether it was engineering, traveling, recreating, investing in real estate, his head buried in Sudoku, or just laughing and having a great time, I rarely saw Gary down. It was an honor to be his friend.
Hello, everybody. I'm Blaise Bresco. And Gary Swenson was a dear friend of mine. Gary hired me in 1992, in February. At that time, I'd had 2 years of experience, and it was somewhat of a recessionary period for some firms, and we were on part-time hours. I had a buddy named John Barry that was working a couple of years out of college. We went to the University of Washington, and he was working there, and I stayed in touch with him, and I said, hey, I'm on part-time hours, what's going on over there? And he said, well, I think we're hiring. And so I'm sure I got an interview because of him, because at that time I was designing tilt-up buildings for a three-man shop in Bellevue, and not a great resume. So I came to downtown, and all I had on my resume was that, and waiting tables at night for extra cash, and playing pickleball on the weekends. And so I was wondering what we were going to talk about. We talked about restaurants and pickleball. My references were scarce, so to speak, but he called them all. My girlfriend, my pickleball partner, and one of the bar hangouts at Garcia's restaurant. And why is this such a special story? Because it epitomizes what I didn't know at the time that I learned over years and years, which is what was the most important thing for Gary was the person. And he made sure that he taught that he spoke about that our entire relationship. So he hired me shortly thereafter, and it was in that first year that I was dating my wife, Miriam, who's a French citizen and living in France. And Gary wanted to be involved, wanted to know all about her, wanted to know about her family. He wrote all the recommendation letters to the consulate, and we got married in 1994, and very quickly, Miriam's parents wanted to know about my employer, because Miriam's father ran his engineering company in France, and all of a sudden we started to have a relationship. So every time Miriam's parents came to town, we went out to dinner. And eventually in 2002, I believe, we moved to France for 1 year. And it was wonderful because Gary and Becky took a trip to France to see us, spend some time at, in the area with us, with Miriam's family along the coast. And what I want to say about this is that sharing life experiences was such a big deal to Gary, and it's what drew me to him. I wasn't that kind of person, and he's got a way of making you a better person. Professionally, I think what drew me to Gary was, as Becky said, he loved his work. I loved my work. And I was naturally attracted to all engineers that love their work. They also tend to love life. They also tend to have great relationships. The proof is all the friends at Swenson Say Fagét, Gary Swenson Pervix, my partner Dan Say, Mike Nowens, Jim Harriet that are here today. It is so great to see you. Nick Russo, I hope he's here, so I can get a chance to talk to him. That was the culture that Gary created, and we loved it, and those friendships and never just go on forever. Just speak a moment about the wonderful professional mentorship from Gary. Engineering was important to him, for sure, and he was a great engineer, and he had high expectations in engineering, but he put emphasis on people. Get to know your clients. Have the same goals as them. Be friends with them, why not? You may like it. Not only are you going to enjoy your job, you're going to fill your life with joy. And he was so right. And that's why I love coming in at 6 in the morning and leaving at 7 at night. And that was such a big deal that I could be with Gary for that many hours of the day. And lastly, about people, Gary was a great mentor because of those things, but he was also a great mentor of a mentor. He was pushing all the time for us, managers, to carry that same emphasis to our staff. So he wasn't just trying to make me a better engineer, he was trying to make me be a better mentor and get to know other employees, get to know other people. That's the best part about coming to work. And you find out about their lives, and guess what? You start to have dinner with their wives, and you find out about their kids, and there's nothing better in life. I'll finish with the definition we were forced to learn in high school that I'll never forget, of love. Love is the creative, active concern for the life and growth of that which is being loved. I'm sure there's a lot of other definitions. Gary was the embodiment of this definition. The richness of Gary's life is measured by how many lives he has touched. It's in fact contagious. My wife, my kids, my friends, co-workers, they all profit. From how my loving friend Gary has made a better human being of me. I love you, Gary. Goodbye for now. Thank you for this opportunity.
Quite a bit shorter here. Gary Swenson, my first boss out of college, a mentor and a dear friend. I'm Celine. Yes, I'm Celine. So many years ago, as a young idealistic graduate of architecture and civil engineering, I decided to start out my career as a structural engineer. I threw out my net wide to engineering firms all over the country when I found Swenson Say Fagét. I truthfully wasn't entirely convinced they really did engineering. They seemed a little too cool, too interesting to be engineers. I did, of course, come to find out they do engineering, and they do it really well. When Gary invited me to interview at Swenson Say Fagét, and Becky and him invited me to stay with them in their mother-in-law unit, I immediately knew Gary was different. Gary sent me detailed instructions from the airport. This was before Google Maps. His instructions to West Seattle included directions to exit off I-5 towards Spokane Street Bridge. While I got some of those words a little jumbled, I ended up heading towards Spokane City, across the I-90 bridge. When I stopped at a gas station and asked the attendant where the hell I was, he amusedly pointed off the map. When I finally found my way to Gary and Becky's home late that night, I expected to be fired even before I was hired. Especially since I knew I had kept Gary up, judging that most of his emails came to me in the wee hours of the morning. Thankfully, Gary still hired me despite my inability to follow instructions. As an engineer in training, Gary taught me many things, both big and small. I remember his engineering scribbles and the amazing sketches that were essentially art. I recall once working on a building that had a steel and glass tower. I did most of the basic engineering, and I watched Gary scribble out some calculations at the back of my engineering pad for this glass and steel tower. Of course, months later, when the plan reviewer contacted me to show them my calculations, I panicked, as all I had to back up the design were some of Gary's mad scribbles. But Gary did not teach me just engineering. He taught me some very important lessons that guide me to this day. 2 guiding moments in particular. I had started volunteering at Habitat for Humanity not too long after I was hired. I found volunteering on construction extremely rewarding. I remember approaching Gary nervously to ask if I could squeeze my workday into 4 days so that I could spend Fridays working on the construction site. I came with my case prepared. I told him how rewarding it was, and that working on site helped me understand construction, which in turn helped me become a better engineer. I remember him telling me, "Do it. First and foremost, because it makes you happy." I remember being completely floored. The bottom line wasn't profitability and efficiency, and while all that stuff remains important, the bottom line in this case was joy. Another moment. I was working on a project that was profitable for our team. I learned a lot while working on it, but soon learned that I was being groomed to be the project manager. I wasn't too keen on that. As an idealistic architecture graduate, I had strong opinions about what the built environment should be like. I had strong beliefs in what made vibrant, livable, and beautiful communities. This project didn't quite check those boxes. I felt torn. On one hand, I was a recent graduate. Wasn't this a great opportunity? What place did I have to be so picky? Should I just say yes for the experience and be choosy later on in my life? I expressed all of this to Gary, knowing full well that this job was profitable for our team, and expecting him to encourage me to give it a go. But instead, he told me, "If you give away your values now while you're young, you'll find that when you're older, you'll have no more values left to give." "What if we lose them as clients?" I asked. "If we don't want to work with them, we will find others," he said. When I heard of Gary's passing, I was telling my family these stories. My sister said, "Gary sounds amazing." I said he was amazing, and then I quickly corrected myself. He is amazing. He continues to live through the incredible impact he has made in this city and all the things he helped engineer, as well as all the lives he has touched along the way. As true as a mentor can get, Gary Swenson taught me engineering, but he also taught me some pretty incredible life lessons. Integrity, work hard, play harder. Work matters, but relationships matter more. To pursue what is beautiful and interesting, to surround yourself with those you like and love, and to embody generosity beyond measure. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Nick Russo, and I know quite a few of you, not everybody unfortunately, because I know that about everybody I ever met through Gary was a pretty special person. So about a week after Gary died, I wrote a remembrance of him, and I had thought I would read that here today, but then I realized it's 7 pages long, and I am somewhat dyslexic and a slow reader, particularly when I read out loud. So this morning I got up early to come up with some more simplified thoughts. So this is that version. I had no intention of becoming an engineer before I met Swenson. I was in graduate school training to be an architect, and thought I would spend one summer doing structural drafting and then be on my way to be the next Louis Kahn, Charles Rennie Mackintosh, or Bruce Goff. Modest ambitions. That summer turned into 22 years of working for and with Gary and 36 years of friendship. I was a structural drafter for the first few years, but then Swenson trained me on the job to be an engineer. He explained to me that when we met that he liked to hire architects and architectural students as drafters because engineers didn't get trained to draft, and he wanted his drawings to look at least as good as those of his clients. What Gary taught me was that structural engineering can easily be as creative an endeavor as architecture, and the collaboration between the engineer and architect is key to creating amazing buildings. When I started with Gary, he had recently moved his office into what had been the condo that he, Becky, and Laura lived in on Post Avenue in Pioneer Square. Swenson engineers had outgrown the more compact space in the Triangle building, so Gary and his family moved onto their sailboat moored in Eagle Harbor on Bainbridge Island. One family member who didn't make the transition to living on the water was Thelma the cat. She apparently didn't do well on the water. So she returned to Post Avenue and lived in Gary's office, making cozy nests between the rolls of drawings and cuddling on Gary's desk as he petted her while he worked. I can remember a number of times going in to look for some drawings in Gary's office, and while I was doing this, being startled when Thelma would leap from the desk onto the desk from her cozy sleeping spot in the drawings on the upper shelves to see what I was up to. One of the highlights of that office was a deck on the upper level, sort of a roof deck where we would have office happy hours on a regular basis. And the other great thing about that office was it was located near some wonderful restaurants, and Gary liked nothing better than to take the whole office out to lunch. And as a young architecture student, I can remember these places, going to these fabulous restaurants that there was no way I could afford to go to on my own. And we would have these wonderful lunches. Over the years, the company name would change from Swenson Engineers to Ratty Swenson Perbix Clark, then Ratty Swenson Perbix, briefly RSPEQE, and eventually Swenson Say Fagét. And even before I started with Gary, there had been an earlier incarnation of Swenson Engineers and Smith and Swenson with his good friend Reichel. During my time, we moved from the Post Avenue office into much more corporate offices above Brooks Brothers at 4th and Union, and then to the shared office with Jan Gleason above what would eventually become Dahlia Lounge in Belltown. And for a short time, some of us would be in the storefront that eventually became the restaurant. Then we moved into a shared office with another architect, Don Carlson, on Post Alley in Pike Place. Then eventually, we bought the building with Stephen Johnson on 3rd Avenue in Belltown that became the headquarters of Swenson Say Fagét that is to this day. Throughout all of these changes and moves, the constant was Gary Swenson, unafraid to reinvent the firm any number of times, always looking for a way to make it a better place to work. Gary's brilliance, enthusiasm, kindness, and creativity rubbed off on all of those around him at every step of the way. Gary was probably the hardest working person I've ever known throughout his career. He would start at impossibly early hours and work long days with intensity that truly amazes me, especially now that I'm 60 and I know how easy it is to be distracted from the task at hand. Something I experienced often when I was starting out as an engineer was a Swenson quality control review of my projects. He would take a set of drawings, and when he was done, the pages were covered with red marks, pencil scribblings, calculations, and Post-it notes. At first, I thought it was a sign of how badly I had screwed up. But what I quickly learned is that Gary saw these reviews not only as a way to find errors and omissions, but as a way to look at all the possible ways to solve the problems at hand, to help me to be a better engineer, and for Gary himself to learn something from the experience. Gary's workspaces had a beautiful chaos to them, and any empty space in the office was a potential area for his workspace to expand into. I loved looking at Gary's calculations. For most engineers, they are the math required to get to the quickest answer. Swenson's were a diagram of thought, consideration, and reconsideration. I remember getting into the office unusually early back in the Ratty Swenson Perbix days and finding that Gary, who had probably been there since 4 a.m., had work spread out over 5 different workstations. He took the drawings from my spot and moved them to one of the conference tables so that he could keep on going. As intense and focused as Gary was at work, the one thing I discovered early on was that if I needed to talk to him, all I needed to say was, "Gary, can we talk?" And he would give me his full, undivided attention. I have many fond memories of office lunches at amazing restaurants around town, incredible holiday parties at unique venues, shareholder retreats at amazing places, and at one point, we didn't have much of a conference room, so we would hold shareholder meetings over breakfast at local restaurants before the workday got going. Gary and I would usually find an excuse to meet for lunch on a regular basis while we worked together and for years afterwards. I cannot think of Swenson without thinking of wonderful food and wine. I'm not sure at what point our relationship transitioned from boss-employee to friendship, but it did somewhere along the way. After I left Swenson Say Fagét to become a sole proprietor in 2007, Gary's mentorship, advice, friendship, and encouragement were key to making it all work. I feel incredibly lucky to have stumbled into the best summer job on the planet 36 years ago, and to have known Swenson as my boss, co-worker, my business partner, and friend. Not only do I have a career that I never imagined, but I have met many amazing people through knowing him, including Becky and Laura. Gary was so incredibly brilliant. It seemed like there was no problem he could not solve. He was so funny, he managed to see the funny side of just about any situation. And I've never known anybody who could laugh at himself as easily and uproariously as he did. I can claim all sorts of high-minded ideals or practical reasons why I ditched architecture for engineering. But as good as an explanation as any was that it was just a fun place to work. And Gary was the kindest boss I had ever met. He changed my life and influenced me in so many ways to this day. Sorry. And I know that I am far from the only one in this room who could say that. And then I was thinking about Gary's love of wine, and just one small story came to mind this morning. We were planning an office Christmas party, and we had this committee together, and we were discussing how much wine and beer and stuff to order, and Gary said, "Well, I think we should order 2.5 bottles of wine per person." And I looked at him, I said, "Are you sure that's the right number, Gary?" He said, "Yeah, because some people don't drink wine, so that'll work out." So I know that I wouldn't be standing here if I had had 2.5 bottles, but thank you all, and I miss Gary incredibly. Thank you.
I should also say that Nick is responsible for this sculpture here. which he created for Gary's retirement party. Did I miss anybody that I asked to speak? Because I'm going to read something from Gary Mackenzie, and then we're going to open it up for anybody else that would like to say anything. Gary Mackenzie retired in, I don't remember when. He has been with Gary since 1970. He says 77, but I think it was earlier than that. I think Gary Mackenzie is probably the person that's been with Gary longer than I have. Anyway, Gary Mackenzie has retired. He has moved to Daytona, Florida to care for his 90-something or other old mother. So he could not be here today. In 1977, I met Gary. I had recently graduated from Washington State University with a double degree in architecture. Gary had recently become a partner with Reichel Smith, creating the firm Smith & Swenson. I remember the one thing Gary mentioned during my interview was that the office was non-smoking. That was an important one for Mac. That was the last interview I would have. For the next 34 years and 7 different firms, I would work with Gary as an employer and partner. During those years, Gary had many roles and responsibilities: sole proprietor, senior partner, CEO, rainmaker, visionary. Whatever the role, Gary gave 100%. He was more than just those titles. He was a mentor, advocate, listener, and friend. Gary was also the first person in the office and usually the last to leave. I decided to beat him in 1 week. Starting on Monday at 6:30, I came in a half hour early. An hour early each day, and there he was. Finally, on Friday around 4:30, I had beat him for about 15 minutes. I could go on for hours telling stories about Christmas parties, shareholder retreats, team building, exercises, and other. Gary was always trying to make the firms and the individuals in them better. He was always supportive, collaborative, and respectful. His dedication to quality and creativity lead to long-lasting relationships with clients, employees, and peers. During the early years of Swenson Say Fagét, his leadership and vision helped to create a firm that people were drawn to. He was always willing to try new things and to make it a better place to work, to create an environment that was not only successful for the firm, but also for the individuals in it. Thinking back over the years, I remember an activity that showed a lot about Gary. Swenson Engineers was part of the A&E Architectural and Engineering Volleyball League that played at Green Lake during the summer. The games were informal, enjoyable, and competitive. I feel the way Gary played volleyball was the way he lived life. Always around the ball, diving, running, and jumping. He would let you take your shot, but if there was hesitation, he was there to take the shot. His influence on my life was huge. Other than my father, I cannot think of any male who has had a larger one. I believe he helped me make me a better person in so many ways. My friend will be dearly missed. Mac. So that is everything I have. I would like anyone that would like to say anything to please feel free to raise their hand. If not, we're going to move on to some food. Sure.
I remember when Gary and Becky.
Lynn.
Okay. So I'm Lynn Perkins. I'm the ex-wife of Nick Rousseau. And when we first moved to town, one of the first things that happened was a barbecue with Swenson. Now, we were coming out of New Mexico. Nick was from South Africa. I came from Connecticut. But we had this barbecue. They had a barbecue that was like this big. And they were throwing handfuls of oysters and mussels onto this thing. They'd pop open and you'd suck them down with some wine. Then the fish came out, and I just thought, this is what I expected of the Northwest. And the food stuff. But what I wanted to say, is I don't have a professional. I'm an architect and project manager, but I didn't work with Gary or for Gary. But even if I hadn't had the connection through Nick to Gary, I think it'd be pretty hard to miss his effect on the business of architecture, design, structural engineering. I totally appreciate that. But one thing that when Becky was talking about her long courtship, I remember when they got married, and I remember the wedding invitation. Do you remember that? Is it on the table? Yes. So, for those of you who haven't seen it, it said on the front, if we were dogs, and then when you opened it up, there was a couple collies with their faces morphed onto the photo. Our courtship would have been 186 years. Thought that was pretty good. But Becky, I just want to acknowledge, how much of a connection that you were for me to Gary. Also, I want to mention Saint Joan Boileau. So in my early days of encounters with this group. Saint Joan was the Joan Boileau, who was the titular office manager, but she was really probably in charge, right? Yep. And also that name, drink water. It should be, bois vin, drink wine. Anyway, it's an oblique connection, but I really appreciate it. Thanks.
All right, unless anybody has something that they just have to say, I think we'll call it a day for this part of it anyway. Thank you so much for coming. It means so much to us that you all came. Yes, Ms. Veda?
Could I come up and
You can.
and do something with the microphone that everybody would love to hear?
Okay, hold on. I just wanted to say one thing that I forgot to say earlier, and that is that we have Harlow, who is going to be 9 in November, and Veda, who just turned 7 on the 10th. Now, Harlow's name is Harlow Swenson Finn, and Veda's name is Veda James Finn. So both girls bear the middle name of their grandfathers. Now, because Veda's grandpa is James Finn, we couldn't name her Veda Finn. So she got to be Veda James Finn. Okay, thank you. Okay, so the food is in the other room, where if you haven't seen the pictures, go see the pictures, and we'll have some more time for visiting.